So this is the second video lecture on David Hume's An Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. So in the first video, we discussed Hume's really famous argument that sentiment is the foundation of morals. That actually morality is not found on reason alone, from the mind. And that, yes, there are, though, indeed, even if morality is not something transcendental and absolute, there are still value judgments which do indeed exist. So that's his argument, of course, against moral skepticism. And if you remember, he tried to prove this by demonstrating that benevolence is that universal and highest virtue. That one thing which is what unites all the other different kinds of virtues that we may praise and all the different kinds of vices that we may blame when they lack benevolence. And so much of Hume's argument stems from what he's famous for, his empiricism, but also that the things that are most important to us actually are not derived from reason, but they're natural, and they're found on instinct and custom and habit. Things that, of course, will not be something that Kant would say, and it's not something that, science would like to admit, of course, although, of course, certain scientists do admit this, that, morality is not something quantifiable. But it's important to note that there are these different social virtues which stem from benevolence. So if you remember, there's that of sociability, mercy, gratitude, friendliness, generosity, natural affection, public spirit, and sympathy with others. And these are all different virtues which in some way are related to benevolence. So in chapter 3, and then still in chapter 4, what we're discussing with this lecture, of course, is the question of justice. Is justice as well founded in sentiment or something else? For Hume, justice is that virtue which indirectly brings about benevolence. That if benevolence is a direct virtue and that it is natural in all of us, and it comes out in the natural things we praise or is lacking in those things we blame, well, for Hume, it's actually indirect. And that means the goal of this chapter for him is to explain that public utility is the sole origin of justice, not sentiment, actually. So, first, he has this, I guess we could say, famous claim about justice and resources. So imagine the world was materially abundant. We were not lacking in food, not lacking in shelter, not lacking in water, not lacking in all sorts of materials, whatever they may be, right? So this would be, if I remember correctly, the Star Trek world. In Star Trek, they live in a materially abundant world, right? So there's no need of resources. Hume claims, famously, that in such a state, if, things weren't scarce, we had, plenty of food and everything else, right, we could ever want, that every social virtue would flourish, right? So benevolence would flourish and all the other ones I listed, but the virtue of justice wouldn't even exist. The concept of justice would not exist in a materially abundant world. So he says, for what purpose make a partition of goods where everyone has already more than enough? Why give rise to property where there cannot possibly be any injury? Why call this object mine when upon the seizing of it by another, I need but stretch out my hand to possess myself of what is equally valuable? Justice, in that case, being totally useless, would be an idle ceremonial and could never possibly have place in the catalog of virtues, unquote. So he's saying, right, if we had everything we could ever need, shelter, again, water, food, and so on, and more than that, right? I mean, things, more than that, like games or whatever, right, to keep us happy, that there would be no need of justice. And why? Well, let's think, real quick back to Aristotle and those two kinds of justice, right? Distributive and retributive justice. Well, for one, what would there be to distribute if everyone has enough that they would ever need of anything? And two, well, what kind of retributive justice would there need to be where, someone does a wrong so they have to give back, something they stole or whatever? Why would that need to be done if, well, is it really stealing if you take something that there's an infinite amount of? So this leads Hume to argue that justice is a convention. It is not something transcendental. It is not something natural. It is a convention. So continuing with this, the same theme, consider this time, though, unlimited benevolence, right? That all humans on earth have maybe potentially we have an unlimited capacity to be benevolent. But in this case, it's that everyone actually displays an unlimited amount of benevolence to others. If there were unlimited benevolence in the present predisposition of the human heart, as Hume says, justice too would be unnecessary. It would not exist. He says, it seems evident that the use of justice would, in this case, be suspended by such an extensive benevolence. Nor would the divisions and barriers of property and obligation have ever been thought of. Every man, upon this supposition, being a second self to another, would trust all his interests to the discretion of every man, without jealousy, without partition, without distinction. I mean, I think that's pretty intuitive, right? What need would there be for justice if everyone is benevolent? Why would anyone harm or wrong someone else, right? So now we consider two cases where we have an abundance of resources and an abundance of benevolence. So one on the case material goods, material things, and on the other case emotional, sentimental capacities, characteristics. In both of those cases, Hume is saying if they are unlimited, then justice, again, would not be necessary, further aiding what he thinks is his argument that it is conventional. But we need to consider two more cases first. So considering an extreme abundance of resources and benevolence, in this case, consider extreme scarcity. There's only a finite amount, and it's an especially finite. I mean, of course, there's a finite amount generally, but I mean an especially finite amount, right? There's a drought or something like that, of water. Same thing with food, shelter, all kinds of goods. Suppose society fell into extreme need of resources, as in what is Hobbes's state of nature. So the philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously argues this state of nature, this well, for him, I guess maybe it's not so fictional, but for Hume, it's fictional. Talk about that in a moment. But the state of nature for Hobbes is this existence of humans prior to the existence of the state, right, or of the government, with this monopoly on authority. So in this state of nature, before there's a government, right, with a central authority on rules that we have to obey and so on. Hobbes argues this state of nature is terrible, that human beings are selfish, we're constantly attacking one another and lying to one another, there's deceit, that it is a life which is solitary, nasty, short, brutish, and poor, as Hobbes famously says. And of course, this would be because there is a finite resources on the earth, right? Every place of land you're going to live isn't going to be the same. Some places you're probably going to live a better life than others, right? Just based on the resources. And so this inevitably pits humans against one another, leading to conflict, perpetual war. Hobbes famously says, the state of nature is a state of war of all against all. So consider a situation like that, right? This extreme scarcity of resources. Hume argues that in this case, justice also would not exist. He says, quote, the use and tendency of that virtue, justice, is to procure happiness and security by preserving order in society. But where the society is ready to perish from extreme necessity, no greater evil can be dreaded from violence and injustice, and every man may now provide for himself by all the means which prudence can dictate or humanity permit. So, of course, there can't be justice if we are kind of, through no fault of our own, pitted against one another for survival, right? And then in the fourth case, this is where we have an extreme scarcity of benevolence. So remember, there was extreme abundance of benevolence where everyone acts toward one another. The relation is of extreme benevolence, extreme love and caring for the other. Now suppose this is deficient, right, in all human beings. Suppose one, as Hume says, fell into the society of ruffians, where there was an extreme lack of benevolence. Here, too, Hume argues, justice would not exist. So I've got two quotes here to read about this. The first, he says, he, this person that has fallen into the society of ruffians, meanwhile can have no other expedient than to arm himself. You, if you exist in this society, have no choice but, out of self-love, I believe it was Rousseau, right? This amour propre, this love of just the preservation of yourself. Or, sorry, it would be a amour de soi. Sorry, amour de soi, amour propre is different. A baneful love of the self. But a simple amour de soi, this love of the self, you inevitably must guard yourself. You can't trust other people. The moment you might be benevolent might be the case where you get stabbed in the back. And so Hume says, to make provisions of all means of defense and security, this person must arm themselves. And his particular regard to justice being no longer of use to his own safety or that of others, he must consult the dictates of self-preservation alone, without concern for those who no longer merit his care and attention. And the second quote, he says, and were a civilized nation engaged with barbarians? I mean, consider this. So we've got a nation that seems itself as civilized. We have these rules and we're honorable, right? Consider this nation we're engaged, as Hume says, with barbarians who observe no rules even of war. Hume says the former must, so the civilized nation must also suspend their observance of these rules and these virtues. And why? Because it might be that if they don't, they won't survive. Think about that. I mean, there are typically modern cases, right, of warfare, modern warfare, there are a lot of international rules. And what ends up happening, a lot of the times, you see conflicts like, maybe it could be the Vietnam War or whatever, right, that drag out because to just lack all benevolence, I mean, if there was no benevolence in the Vietnam War, let's be fair, but to lack any kind of benevolence, right? I mean, that would be into just, I don't know, bomb and destroy an entire people. That would be an extreme act of evil. And what ends up happening? Well, of course, the United States lost the war. I don't know what there was to win, but you don't win, right? And so Hume is saying that's, the case, that when you, to a certain extent, still try to maintain those rules of honor or whatever, that even that nation, if it was in a fight for its life, would have to suspend those rules and those virtues. So this too, in this case, where there's a scarcity of benevolence, justice would not exist. So we have then a case where it is only in a moderation of resources and benevolence where justice can exist. Justice for Hume is, again, a convention. It is a public utility which exists only where resources and benevolence make it possible, which is not entirely, but for the most part, right, it is our modern world where we have a reliable amount of resources where, actually this pandemic is a good example where people running and flocking to the stores and trying to hoard these resources. Why? Well, because there is the thought, even if it's so far in the back of the mind or whatever, right? There is this thought that, well, normalcy could be suspended. Right? Those guarantees, well, maybe they're not so guaranteed. And those resources can dry up. And then what am I going to do? And so you hoard these things that maybe a lot of other people actually really need these resources, like toilet paper. I had a friend who actually really needed toilet paper and had to ask the GM of a restaurant he works at if he could take a roll of toilet paper home because none of the stores had any, right? Because people bought it all up. So Hume says, thus the rules of equity or justice depend entirely on the particular state and condition in which men are placed, and owe their origin and existence to that utility, that usefulness, which results to the public from their strict and regular observance. So in a civil society, then, Hume is arguing, the idea of property becomes necessary. And this is something very different, actually, from what we were discussing earlier in the semester with Aristotle. Justice is something that is not found on the existence of property. Now, this actually happens to be an early modern phenomena with this focus on property and property rights. That is not the case in ancient Greece, especially not in Aristotle's philosophy. In Aristotle, of course, remember, justice exists because it is intimately related to ethics. It is that system which helps, to kind of set up and ensure we behave ethically by carrying out praise or blame. In the case of Hume, it's a bit different. That property actually is a result of convention and is therefore something useful and intimately related to justice, as where it's not the case with Aristotle. I mean, it's of course related because if you steal or violate the property of someone else, retributive justice would play a role, of course, in Aristotle, but it doesn't have that intimate relation, we could say. Hence, therefore, for Hume, justice derives its usefulness to the public because, since to some extent, resources are scarce, we want a system where we are, as much as possible, guaranteed that someone can't just come and break into our house, right, and steal our things. Hence, alone for Hume arises the merit and moral obligation of the defense of property, and therefore of justice, and the virtue of justice. So, related but perhaps a bit tangential, a question does actually arise in that, justice is conventional, and in Hume relating to the state of justice, talking about that with Hobbes, he actually says that whether such a condition of human nature could ever exist, the condition of the state of nature where it's a war of all against all and there's no government and we're all selfish and out to get one another and we can't trust one another. Hume says whether that condition of human nature could ever exist, that we would just inevitably, we were born that way and it's natural we act that way. Or if it did, could continue so long as to merit appellation of a state, may justly be doubted. So he does not believe, or he doesn't think it's reasonable to think actually that that state of nature that Hobbes described actually did exist prior to civil society. Or that we would, that's, kind of like our natural state, and that like society paves over it or anything like that. He doesn't think we're naturally evil or selfish in that regard. But he says men are necessarily born in a family society, at least, and are trained up by their parents to some rule of conduct and behavior. But this must be admitted that if such a state of mutual war and violence was ever real, if society, again, think about with this pandemic, right? If society were to collapse and the government is now powerless, he thinks it's reasonable to argue that the suspension of all laws of justice from their absolute inutility, so they're no longer useful, is a necessary and infallible consequence. Why? Well, because again, you need some power which is able to carry out justice. It can't be the case that I just have an agreement with you that, like, well, if you wrong me, then you'll, say sorry and you'll do whatever is right to, make amends. Well, what reason do I have to believe that? If you're going to wrong me, well, then why would I think then, therefore, you would, apologize and do whatever to amend that wrong? The only way we can be sure, and therefore the only way justice can exist, is if there is some force, the state or government, that can carry that out. But what I think is interesting about this, and why I think this brings up a question of nature versus nurture, is it does question to what extent are we born or predisposed, right, to act in certain ways, or is it that society can, we're just like a blank slate in which we can just be kind of molded to act whatever way and take up whatever beliefs they may be. I think that's just an interesting question to think about yourself. Hume, though, errs more on the side of nature. Now, of course, he does think there is a role for nurture, and hence, justice is a convention. So to some extent, it's a nurturing process. But he does think, of course, we are born predisposed with at least certain ethical, moral capacities. And of course, benevolence being universal, right? So that would be something naturally in us, or at least the capacity to be benevolent is something naturally in us. But I leave this question up to you as to whether the morality of ourselves is something that is inherent, or it is something due to nurture. Okay, so that justice is conventional, sure, right? Hume thinks he's now demonstrated this is the case. Does this mean, though, that justice is arbitrary? Right? So conventional would just mean, well, it works. It's useful for us, of course, to have justice because it's a way in which we can live a peaceful, happy life. But does that mean it is arbitrary? Because it's not something natural, right? So actually, this goes against Locke. It's not something found in nature. And this also goes against, for him, religious superstition, where Hume wants to say, well, justice also isn't something that's just divine. It's God-given. So does that mean it's arbitrary? Right? There's no foundation to justice then. Hume says of this, by what rule have we, by which we can distinguish one person's property from another? Here we must have recourse to statutes, customs, precedents, analogies, and 100 other circumstances, some of which are constant and inflexible, some variable and arbitrary. So by what rule is there And he admits, of course, that in all these different cases, if we want to look at different societies, especially if we want to compare modern and past, but even in modern societies, comparing, for example, the United States and other countries, France, Brazil, India, wherever else, right? There are different cases where laws exist differently, right? And of course, a lot of these laws, right? I mean, they're not necessarily rational. I mean, think about, like, in the United States, we still have these laws like you can't buy alcohol before 12 noon on a Sunday. Why? Is there anything in nature that says, of course, that must be the case? No, right? So Hume admits, yeah, some are variable and arbitrary, and others, though, still are constant and inflexible. Like we will find, likely at least, in some cases we might find that there are loopholes, I guess we could say. But for the most part, we would find that, for example, murder, right, is something punishable. So that would be an example of something which is constant, right, and inflexible. All of these, though, that these rules are enforced by different statutes and customs and so on. For Hume, they all converge in the interest and happiness of human society. That there is something, though, that does unite them. There is some common theme, right? Just like, think back when he was thinking about with benevolence, and we had the list of virtues and the list of vices. And we wanted to see, is there one characteristic that unites them all? A little bit similar here, what he's trying to do. So again, he wants to then compare justice with superstition. And he wants to argue that superstition is, in fact, arbitrary. So consider superstition. And here I do want to read from Hume. So this would be at the bottom of page 93 going on to page 94. So Hume writes, those who ridicule vulgar superstitions and expose the folly of particular regards to meats, days, places, postures, apparel, have an easy task. While they consider all the qualities and relations of the objects and discover no adequate cause for that affection or antipathy, veneration or horror, which have so mighty an influence over a considerable part of mankind. A Syrian, for example, would have starved rather than taste pigeon. An Egyptian would not have approached bacon. But if these species of food be examined by the senses of sight, smell, or taste, or scrutinized by the sciences of chemistry, medicine, or physics, no difference is ever found between them and any other species, nor can that precise circumstance be pitched on, which may afford a just foundation for the religious passion. A fowl on a Thursday is lawful food, on Friday abominable. Eggs in this house and in this diocese are permitted during Lent. 100 paces farther, to eat them is a damnable sin. This earth or building yesterday was profane. Today, by the muttering of certain words, it has become holy and sacred. Such reflections as these, in the mouth of a philosopher, one may safely say are too obvious to have any influence, because they must always, to every man, occur at first sight, and where they prevail not of themselves, they are surely obstructed by education, prejudice, and passion, not by ignorance or mistake. So with superstition, right, all these different examples he lists, there doesn't seem to be any, I mean, there is there is a rhyme and a reason, of course, right? There are justifications for these different, as Hume is calling them, superstitions. But for Hume, they're ultimately unfounded. And this goes back to his epistemology, where there's nothing in experience which says that it is so that, if you haven't blessed this piece of meat, you shouldn't eat it for some whatever reason, right? Hume wants to look at experience and says experience says, well, that's nonsense. And that has to do with his arguments against religious speculation and metaphysics. But then, though, right, compare justice. Is justice just as arbitrary as superstition? So, he says, hear this, right? It may appear to a careless view, or rather a too abstracted reflection, that there enters a like superstition into all the sentiments of justice, and that if a man expose its object, or what we call property, to the same scrutiny of sense and science, he will not, by the most accurate inquiry, find any foundation for the difference made by moral sentiment. I may lawfully nourish myself from this tree, but the fruit of another, of the same species 10 paces off, it is criminal for me to touch. Had I worn this apparel an hour ago, I had merited the severest punishment, but a man, by pronouncing a few magical syllables, has now rendered it fit for my use and service. And he's got many more examples. I'll actually give my own. I have just experienced the other day. So I wrecked my car just barely, I swear, right? I hit the back of this truck. Doesn't do any damage to this truck. It messes up the front of my car. I'm thinking, all right, but it's just some cosmetic damage, whatever. It's not that big a deal. Take it to the mechanic. A week later, I get a call. Insurance says they're going to total it. The law says that, it is approached 75% of what they have determined its value to be. Even though this car, low mileage for its age, great condition, brand new brakes, tires, no engine problems, no transmission problems, the interior is in great condition. I've got a whole book of everything that's ever been done to the car, all the work on it, right? I mean, this car is in great condition, minus just the front bumper and the hood. And I guess some little extra thing some trouble that costs a bunch of money, right? But as to whether the car runs and would last, it's great value. But it has been determined that, well, I should instead just get a check to go buy a new car, and they're not going to repair the car. Now, that seems arbitrary, and indeed I think it is arbitrary, because I even had the mechanic tell me, had this been 3 years ago, they wouldn't have totaled the car. But just because of the age, even though it's in great condition, it's the age of it, they're going to total it. So it seems to be arbitrary. So is justice arbitrary, just as for Hume he is arguing superstition is arbitrary? Hume argues no. And I'll also explain why, according to Hume, my car being totaled, even though 3 years ago, same condition, it wouldn't have been totaled, Hume is saying it's not arbitrary, because it's a law, right? So this would be, I guess, an act of justice to some extent. For Hume, the reason is there is a material difference between superstition and justice. For him, superstition is something frivolous, useless, and burdensome. Right? What is the point of, having to bless some place or something like that before you walk into it? For Hume, again, experience, he says, shows actually, it doesn't actually do anything. We can look at the results and notice, wow, no result, positive or negative, actually, came about. But on the other hand, for justice, Hume says, it is something absolutely necessary, meaning it's useful, to the public good and existence of society. And that would be in the case of me. The reason why insurance decides to just cut me a check and not repair my car is because likely this law had been passed on behalf of insurance companies because in some way it's useful for them and it's been deemed therefore beneficial to society. Even though I may personally find it to be arbitrary, publicly it's deemed to be useful. So, again, just to reiterate, there is a material difference between superstition and justice, and it is that justice is something useful. That is the foundation of justice, use or utility. And this actually is why Hume influences, as we'll see in a little while, John Stuart Mill. And if you ever read William James, famous American pragmatist, he too is influenced by Hume for similar reasons, although their arguments aren't quite the same, and we'll see some differences a bit later. But it's also important to keep in mind this foundation of justice, right? Being a public utility is not founded on instinct or sentiment like benevolence is, because it's something indirect. Hume argues that it is only through reflection that we can come to realize the use of justice and so bring it into existence, because of course we need institutions to exist to carry out justice. Hume says of this, the convenience, or rather necessity, which leads to justice is so universal and everywhere points to much the same rules, that the habit takes place in all societies. And it is not without some scrutiny that we are able to ascertain its true origin. So with this, we're moving on to chapter 4. So this has to do a little bit more with the role of government and why it's necessary, not just what Hume calls natural justice, right? So why need there be something like positive law in addition to what we could call natural justice? Why, and here's kind of a related question, why mitigate freedom, because of course to some extent this is done with the government, why mitigate freedom in favor of order? And Hume's answer to this question is that, as he says, it is evident that if government were totally useless, it never could have place, and that the sole foundation of the duty of allegiance is the advantage which it procures to society by preserving peace and order among mankind. So on the one hand, natural justice, this sense of justice, which we know it's not founded, on our sentiment. It's not natural to ourselves in the way that benevolence is, he tried to argue. This sense of justice requires that people possess a sufficient amount of intelligence to see the benefit of justice, right? And for Hume, he thinks to some extent, he's at least demonstrating this, trying to explain to you this case. In other cases, you need an adequate amount of experience, of course, as well, to understand the benefit of justice, and that justice is something good. That means that enough people lack this sufficient intelligence, that there must be then an enforcer of the rules of justice, and that would be government. Clearly not enough people, he thinks, on their own, left to their own devices, would follow the virtues of justice. As I was explaining in that earlier example of if you just make a pact with some other person, how can you guarantee that justice, they will do the right if they harm you, right? They will carry out the right in fixing that harm that was done. Hume thinks, well, there wouldn't be enough guarantee in society that perhaps we would then fall back into that state of, even though it's not really the state of nature, we would fall into that state of disorder, right? And that would not then be a case of happiness, which we all, he thinks, naturally want. That means allegiance to government is a quality useful to others. It is actually a virtue. Allegiance to government is a virtue because it is useful to the public. Now, there are some other qualities. He lists some other characteristics that are related to the enforcement of rules. So they're quite interesting, I guess we could say, some of his reasons for these. So when he talks about the rules of chastity and fidelity, that custom that we find throughout the world, of course, where you shouldn't cheat on your partner, there's something about, to some extent, if that is enforced, at least maybe not with the government and strict penalty, but at least customarily, that is something enforced because it's something useful. We find it useful to know that there's going to be a punishment because it deters, of course, people to not cheat on one another. He goes on, though, to talk about chastity in women, and the reason why he thinks, and that with fidelity pertains much more to women. Even he talks about, even after childbearing is possible, women still are put under a greater burden of this rule. And he has this interesting argument about that where he talks about it's often the case that the principle far out, once it's established and becomes a norm, starts to kind of take on a life of its own, and because that's kind of what a norm is, right? It's something we're not necessarily conscious of, and we end up following it almost for the sake of following the rule, even if it no longer serves a use. So that's something he notes where just because, of course, we have these rules doesn't mean they're always good. Other examples are rules of etiquette and social grace. So, of course, there are customs we follow where, I don't know, we don't want, people just peeing on the sidewalk as we're walking down the street, right? We want some cleanliness, at least if it's not useful to us, which it is. It's also agreeable to us. He mentions rules against incest because of deformities it can produce. So, again, those rules are useful to society. He mentions, quote, constancy in friendships, attachments, and familiarities is commendable, and it is requisite to support trust and good correspondence in society. And then finally, he mentions something really interesting, I think, that even among robbers and pirates, he says, there exists some kind of a code, some kind of a set of rules that they abide by. Now, of course, there is that saying, there's no honor among thieves. There's truth to that, of course, but I think what Hume is getting at is that even among thieves, and specifically we'll take pirates, right? There is a certain code of conduct they have to abide by, otherwise they're not going to be as best pirates, right, as they could be. So even in the most worst of cases, we still find the need for some set of rules that, to back up Hume's claim, is something useful. And so therefore public utility, the public good, is therefore tied to some sense of justice. So I think a good discussion question that I'll post on the discussion board is something actually Hume mentions, and this has to do with property rights. So he makes this claim, he says, were the distinction or separation of possessions entirely useless? Can anyone conceive that it should have obtained in society? So were the distinction between things of saying they are mine, something is mine, and something is yours, right? So just property. If the existence of property had no use for society, would property, that concept of property, exist at all? So something to think about. I'd be interested to see your thoughts on that. Maybe you could actually bring up Aristotle, as I was talking about earlier, how this importance of property rights is something that was not essential to Aristotle when he talked about justice. Maybe that might influence, your answer to this question here. Next time, of course, we'll move on to chapter 5. All right?